The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. It's about time. Thank you for giving your time. Thank you for taking the time to set aside what I know is very precious. Our time is precious. As they say, time is money. Time has value, and I understand that, and I don't underestimate the value of your time. We don't want you to waste time. We want you to make the most of your time, especially in times like these unprecedented times, that are times that are unparalleled in most of our lives. Some of us believe that these are exciting times. Some people believe these are the best of times. Others believe these are the worst of times. Some of us are like feeling this is in overtime and I'm out of time. I'm wasting time. I wish I was saving time or making time. I'm ready for a timeout. I'm ready for nap time. I'm ready for dinner time or lunchtime or some time other than the time that I'm experiencing right now. These are difficult times. These are unprecedented times. These are times that most of us are ready to be over. We want it to be game time. We want it to be play time. We want it to be at least halftime or go time or prime time. Doesn't matter how you're experiencing these days. It's about time. And it is. I want to suggest today that whether we realize it or not, how we think about time, what we believe about time, not only shapes how we behave in the world that we live in, it shapes how we see ourselves and others. Much of how we value ourselves, much of how we value the significance of our lives depends on what we believe about time. It's my prayer today that we would learn the lesson of the physics of time, and that we would uncover one particular piece of wisdom, that if we have the proper perspective, not only of the physics of time, but of the theology of time, it can change our lives for the good. It's my prayer today that we might think differently about time. It was a few months ago when I was planning to have this conversation, to do this study about the physics of faith, that I began to read a number of scientific journals, a number of articles online. I began to do some searches of cutting-edge quantum physics and theoretical physics and quantum mechanics, and trying to get educated on these things. In fact, I sent emails to a number of you who are my friends here at Riverbend, who I know are mathematicians or scientists or physicists. There's one friend in particular who I bothered regularly with emails. Thank you, Eric, for your time. But he's an Ivy League trained engineer and physicist, and I would just send him an email and say, string theory dash WTH question mark. And he would send me a 3-page explanation about string theory. And so I started to try to educate myself about the interrelationship between physics and faith. And I reread a book that I had that is one of my favorite books that I would recommend to you if you've never heard of it. It's by Dr. Francis Collins. It's called The Language of God. He was the director of the Human Genome Project. He's a microbiologist. He is currently the director of the CDC, and he's a brilliant microbiologist and a man of deep faith. And the book, The Language of God, that he wrote a number of years ago, is a wonderful book. It didn't help me at all with my consideration of the physics of faith, but I can't recommend it enough. It's a wonderful, encouraging book. But after our first Sunday, a Riverbender, thank you, Hardy, sent me a book by Dr. Gerald Schroeder, who is a MIT-trained physicist. And it's called The Science of God. And Dr. Schroeder makes some interesting observations as a trained physicist about the nature of time. Just see if you can stick up with him for a minute. In 1915, Einstein published a description of nature which revealed an extraordinary and quite seemingly unnatural fact. The rate at which time passes is not the same at all places. At first, such a concept appeared to be highly speculative, so this aspect of nature was referred to as the theory of relativity. Einstein theorized, and later experiments proved, that at the speed of light, the highest speed attainable in our universe, time ceases to flow altogether. The time of all events becomes compressed into the present and unending now. The laws of relativity have changed timeless existence from a theological claim to a physical reality. This means that just as the biblical God is not composed of space or matter, God is also not bound by time. God is outside of time. And being outside of time means to exist in an eternal, unending now, an eternal present that includes past, present, and future simultaneously. Now, for the 7 billion plus people on the planet who are not trained theoretical physicists, this is a migraine-inducing concept. Because we think of everything we experience in our life, we think in terms of time, in terms of what's happened before, in terms of cause and effect, in terms of the future and the present. We understand reality in terms of the metric of time. And what theoretical physics suggests to us is that time is in fact relative, and what our theology suggests to us is that God exists outside of time. Now, in order to get our heads around this, I want to give you a thought experiment. So put down your Egg McMuffin for a second and just think with me for a second. I think we all know how long a second is, don't we? You know how long a second is. If you've ever played hide and seek, a second is 1 Mississippi, right? That's how we used to count it off. You know, if you needed 10 seconds, it was 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Unless, I guess, if you're from Mississippi, then 1 Mississippi can be 3 or 4 seconds. But for those of us from the Northeast, 1 Mississippi was a second. Now, I want you to imagine that you cut that second in half. So you got 1 Mississippi. And then you cut it in half again, and you got 1 miss. And then you cut it in half again, and you got 1 miss. So you start with a full second, a half second, a quarter second, an eighth of a second, a 16th of a second, a 32nd of a second, a 64th of a second, a 128th of a second. And the question is, how many times can you cut that time in half before you run out of time? Before there is nothing left to cut. Now, on the one hand, you realize that theoretically, if you're cutting things in half, you never get to the point where there's nothing. But the math on it says there has to be a place where eventually you run out of time. There is an indivisible moment that cannot be cut in half. Now, scientists, and particularly theoretical physicists, have wrestled with this question for 150 years. It was in 2016 that a group of Harvard-trained scientists created an instrument, an apparatus, that they said they could measure events that took place in 850 septoseconds. A septosecond is 1 or 10 to the negative 17th power, which you would write as 0.003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm still doing 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1. That much of a second. 1 10 to the 17th power. It's a septosecond. I read an article earlier this year in 2020. There were a group of theoretical physicists who said they had devised an apparatus and come up with a theoretical experiment where they could actually measure events that took place in 10 to the negative 33rd power. That's 10 with 33 zeros. But either one of those is 10 zeros short of what physicists call a Planck second. A Planck second is a measurement of time that was developed by a physicist named Max Planck. In 1899, as I understand it, and forgive my sort of ham-fisted scientific explanation, as I understand it, Max Planck realized that Newtonian physics, classic physics, was running up against mathematical boundaries. And they couldn't make calculations of what was beyond that boundary. And he suggested that what mathematicians needed, what physicists needed, was a constant that was a measure of the smallest conceivable amount of time or mass or energy or distance. Something that was so small you couldn't cut it again. You couldn't cut it in half. And he created a formula, and the formula for figuring out Planck time is T, that's how you represent Planck time, equals the square root of h, which is the Planck constant, which is like 6 digits that I can't remember, times the gravitational constant, which is the Newtonian gravitational constant we talked about last week, divided by the speed of light as a constant to the 5th power. And what Max Planck suggested was that by calculating what was an indivisible constant, you could begin to predict where the edge of everything was. Now I know what you're thinking. You're sitting in your home and you got your coffee and you're looking at it and you're going, I didn't make this strong enough today. I mean, did I accidentally turn on PBS? I thought I was watching Riverman. When did Bill Nye the Science Guy become the pastor of my church? This coffee is not strong enough. I need to make stronger coffee. If you're gonna talk about this stuff, Dave, I need bacon at least. And you know that bacon that's just done just perfect. You know the bacon that's it's not flimsy, but it's not like charbroiled. That perfect. I could use some bacon right now. So okay, but get to the point, Dave. What's the point? Here's the point. Time is relative. God exists outside of time because when we get to the point where nothing exists, everything is there. When you get to the point where there is no longer time, you have everything but time. You have all of the time that ever existed. And theoretical physics and quantum mechanics tell us that when we cross the threshold from something into nothing, we discover everything. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, and I know most of you are, and particularly if you are familiar with the story of Jesus of Nazareth in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then you would never consider that the redneck, blue-collar Galilean fisherman who we know of as Simon Peter was a theoretical physicist. In fact, Simon Peter is what I like to call the apostle for the rest of us. Simon Peter, as far as we know, had no formal education. Simon Peter was famous probably for provoking the Lord of the universe to facepalm more often than any of the other apostles. It's Peter who taught us the fine art of putting your foot into your mouth. But none of us would mistake the Apostle Peter for a theoretical physicist. We have preserved in our Bibles 2 letters from the Apostle Peter. They're tucked in near the end of your Bible. Just as you approach the final story in the book of Revelation, you'll come across two letters, and scholars debate. They enjoy picking at the authenticity of these two letters. I believe there's sufficient evidence to suggest that they were in fact written by the Apostle Peter, probably 30 to 35 years after the resurrection of Christ in 33 AD. It's possible, too, that they were written while he was in prison in Rome. The first one written a few months, if not a year, before the second. The second one, and they're called 1st and 2nd Peter. How's that for creative titling? But these two letters that are preserved in our Bible, the second letter that we know of as 2nd Peter may have been written in the weeks, if not days, possibly hours, before his execution. Many scholars believe that Peter was executed in Rome around the time of 67 AD by inverted crucifixion. And in those final days, in those final weeks, he wrote a letter to the church that was tearing itself apart. It was struggling with its suffering. And in what we have as 2 Peter chapter 3, down in the 8th verse, the Apostle Peter says to his readers and says to us, I want you to remember this one thing, dear friends. I don't have much time left. And there's only one thing that I want you to remember. I don't have a lot of time to tell you a lot of other things, so remember this one thing. And then he says something astonishing. He says, remember this, that with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Now, this verse has brought me great comfort, and I'm sure brought some of you great comfort when we're in times of great difficulty or adversity, or we're struggling and there's great uncertainty. This verse reminds us that this too shall end. But from a theoretical physical point of view, this reminds us of the truth that theoretical physics tells us about time, that everything is beyond time, that God himself exists outside of time. Time is relative to God. He goes on to say that the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise as we consider slowness, because God operates in a different time frame. God operates outside of time. And when you operate outside of time, you can't be late. You can't be too slow and you can't be too fast. You are always on time when you're outside of time. It's an astonishing thing that he says. And he says then in terms of the theoretical physicist, he's describing the relativity of time. But as a theologian, he's describing to us the character of God. Because to live outside of time produces one chief attribute, and it's patience. He goes on to say in verse 9, because God is outside of time, because with the Lord a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as of one day, and because he is not slow as we understand slowness, you should realize that God, and his chief attribute, this is the one thing I want you to remember, that God is infinitely patient with you. The way that I like to draw it up, I like to draw it kind of like a pendulum. If this is that dot from that from that experiment of the size, if you wanted to understand the size of Planck distance or a Planck length or a Planck second, the way that you understand it is you put a pinhole in a piece of paper, the smallest hole that you could see. It's about 1/10 of a millimeter. And then you imagine that pinhole was expanded to the size of the known universe. A Planck length or Planck time would represent that dot inside of that expanded dot. That dot is here. That is God outside of time. We live along a timeline. As we approach understanding who God is, time begins to change. Time, theoretical physics tells us, begins to actually slow down. And so the obvious conclusion, not for the theoretical physicist Simon Peter, but for the theologian Simon Peter, is that God can be nothing but patient. God has nothing but time. God lives beyond time. Then he goes on to say, God is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but wanting everyone to come to repentance. Now, if you have a theological tradition like mine, this verse was used as an invitation. This verse was used as a reminder that God is waiting for you to decide. That God, and I always pictured God drumming his fingers, waiting. When are you going to get here, Dave? When are you going to figure it out? When are you going to wake up? And there's an aspect of what Peter is saying that's true. That God is waiting for us to decide, and it's used to portray what I call a punctiliar transformation. And that's also something that can happen. I believe that you could decide today, you could decide in this very moment, I will put this stake in the ground, and all of the things that have terrorized me, and all of the things that have traumatized me, and all of the things that have haunted me, I will put them behind me, and I will live my life in this direction. I will make a decision to follow him, and I will drive that stake in the ground. And I believe that that's legitimate. I mean, it happened to Saul on the road to Tarsus. It happened to John Newton on a slave ship, and he later wrote that he once was lost, but now was found, was blind, but now he sees. I know from my personal experience that those kind of decisions matter, but in a timeless perspective of God, there's more to it than that. And I think what we are talking about, and what Peter is talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, is he's talking about the indivisible elements of patience, of the character of God. And it comes down to two words. The first one is the word apolloumi or apolumai. It's the word for to perish. Apolumia means to destroy or to ruin or to vanquish. That is the word apolumai. And God doesn't want anyone to apolumai, but he wants everyone to metanoia, which means to change your mind, which means to have a transformed mind. And I think what Peter is implying, the theologian Peter, is he is implying to us that patience, drawing near to God, requires apolumai, and metanoia. And the way that I understand it theologically is if we want to become more patient, the first thing we have to do is not let life wreck us. Not let the circumstances and the adversities of life ruin us. We should not perish. You want the street level, what I believe, patience is built on a willingness to not give up, to not quit, to not go back to that point where you say nothing matters, but to always say, this will not ruin me. And the second aspect of the elements of patience is metanoia, to change your mind. And I believe that patience is bred in the idea that I don't have to fix everybody. My ideas are not the only ideas. I don't have to fix everything and everyone. It's an issue of control. And I believe that if we want to change how we experience time, how we experience life, we press into the patience of God by not giving up and by letting go. Theoretical physics have a theory of what they call relative time dilation. Relative time dilation says that the closer you get to traveling at the speed of light, the more time would slow down. And the famous thought experiment to illustrate what time dilation is called the twin experiment. And the twin experiment basically hypothesizes that if you had identical twins, and you put one on the Earth and the other in a spacecraft that was traveling at 8/10 the speed of light. And that astronaut, the one twin, got in that spacecraft and traveled for 40 years out into space and back. By the time that astronaut, traveling at 8/10 of the speed of light, returned to Earth, his watch would have said he had been gone 40 years, but his identical twin brother on Earth would have lived for 76 years, because time dilates, time changes as you approach the point where there is no time. We understand this psychologically, we experience it, don't we? Because you're bored right now. You're bored to tears, and time is dragging. Time is just going so slow. But if you were watching the fourth quarter of your favorite football game, and the score was tied, time would be like moving on. If you're like me and you've been fortunate enough to ever be in love, you know that time can have relative value. There's the time of waiting where time seems to be forever, and then there's the time together where time just seems to fly by. If you're like me and you were raised at Christmas time, and Christmas Eve was time standing still. It was excruciating. Christmas morning went by like a blur. We experience it physically. Imagine you're driving down a highway at 80 miles an hour. I'm sure you've done this. Imagine a 6-lane highway, and 20 feet in front of you is a car traveling 80 miles an hour, and 20 feet behind you is a car traveling 80 miles an hour, and on your right is a car traveling 80 miles an hour, and on your left is a car traveling 80 miles an hour. If you actually gauged your movement by the movement of those things around you, it would look like you were standing still. But a person standing on the side of the road would see you go by them at 162 feet a second. We understand this time dilation. Albert Einstein understood it. Albert Einstein first theorized that the closer we got to the speed of light, the more time changed, the more it slowed down. In fact, Albert Einstein, in his Theory of Relativity, had a famous phrase. He said, "Time is nature's way of keeping everything from happening all at once." Time is a construct, and God lives outside of time. When I was preparing for this series, I read through a number of journal articles and scientific publications, and read the studies that some scientists had posted online, and I read some books, and I got a third book from another riverbender. Thank you, Cam, for that book. And it's this book. It's called The Universe in a Single Atom, and it's by the Dalai Lama. And he is wrestling with the idea of the integration of his faith and science. And this is what the Dalai Lama wrote. As any layperson who has attempted to understand Einstein's theory of relativity is aware, even a basic comprehension of Einstein's principle demands a willingness to defy common sense. As I understand it, the most important implication of Einstein's theory of relativity is that space is not an independent three-dimensional domain, and time is not a separate entity. Rather, they coexist as a four-dimensional continuum of space-time. Time cannot be conceived of as an intrinsically real entity existing independently of temporal phenomenon, but must be understood as a set of relations among temporal phenomenon. Apart from the temporal phenomenon upon which we construct the concept of time, there is no real time that is somehow the grand vessel in which things and events occur, an absolute that has an existence of its own. For a Buddhist thinker, Einstein's demonstration of the relativity of time is extremely helpful in developing the understanding of the relative nature of time. Now, I don't know what you think of the theology of the Dalai Lama. I don't know whether you disagree with him or like what he says, but there's no denying that this is a very spiritual person. And the principle applies that if you seek God, you will find truth. And if you seek truth, you will find God. And I believe the Dalai Lama finds exactly the same thing I do. That God exists beyond time. And it's my prayer today that we would understand that what the physics of time teaches us, what the physics of our faith teaches us, is that the chief attribute of someone who understands the character of a transcendent, timeless God is patience. It is the one thing that draws us near to the character of God in uncertain times. You see, it's about time. I was raised this way. I was raised to value time. I was raised by a father who always said, Dave, stop wasting time. Dave, time is the one commodity everyone gets the same amount of, and you need to use it wisely. They're not making any more of it. One of the phrases that my father used to remind me of constantly when I was growing up was he would say to me, Dave, if you don't have the time to do something right the first time, where are you going to find the time to do it over? What he was teaching me was the value of time, the sacredness of time, the importance of time. Because time is the measure that we use to evaluate our own significance. It's about time. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together.